They had brought in 1,000 physicians, and every last one of them had walked back out with their heads bowed. That was the whisper moving through the halls of Oakhaven Manor on the first gray morning of December, carried from the scullery to the stables and back again. The great Duke Garrick Vane, master of half the county, a man who had once ridden at the front of his own regiment, now lay in the grand chambers of the East Wing, unable to lift so much as a finger, and no one in all of England, it seemed, could tell them why. In the bedchamber, the air was thick and sour. Heavy velvet curtains had been drawn against the daylight, and a dozen candles burned low in their silver holders, throwing long shadows across the Duke's face. He lay beneath embroidered coverlets, still as carved stone, his broad chest rising and falling in shallow, rattling breaths. His skin, once brown from the sun, had gone the color of old wax, and beneath the linen wrappings on his left forearm, something was wrong, something that smelled of rot and damp earth. Around the great four-poster bed stood the finest medical minds the Crown could summon. Men in fine black coats and starched collars, with gold watch chains and leather satchels stamped with the seals of the Royal College. They had bled him, they had blistered him, they had forced bitter tinctures down his throat and pressed hot irons to his skin, and none of it had done a thing except make the great Duke groan in his fevered sleep. Now, one by one, they were fastening the buckles on their bags. "There is nothing more to be done," said the chief physician, a silver-haired man named Dr. Alistair Pruitt, straightening his cuffs. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man well used to delivering bad news to the wealthy. "The corruption has gone into the blood. It is a border fever, brought back from the Eastern Campaign. I have seen it take stronger men than the Duke in half the time." By the tall windows, an old man stood with his hands clenched so tight that his knuckles had gone white. This was Thomas Hale, house steward of Oakhaven for near 40 years, who had first put a wooden sword in young Garrick's hand and taught him to sit a horse. He had served the Duke's father and his father before that. He was too old to fight, and too proud to weep in front of these city gentlemen, so he simply stood and watched them abandon the only master he had ever loved. "So that is all," Thomas said quietly. "You will simply let him die." Dr. Pruitt turned, and there was no shame in his eyes at all. "We are physicians, Mr. Hale, not magicians. When God calls a man home, there is little the science of medicine can do to argue. I would advise you to send for the family, and a priest." The other doctors murmured their agreement and shuffled toward the door, glad perhaps to be quit of a case that could only stain their reputations. Within minutes the grand chamber had emptied, and the sound of carriage wheels grinding away down the frosted gravel drive drifted up through the glass. Thomas Hale stood alone with his dying Duke, and he made a decision that a wiser, more cautious man would never have made. He had heard the stories, you see, tales carried up from the low country by the peat merchants and the eel catchers who came to sell at the winter market, tales of a woman out in the sunken fens who could mend what proper doctors could not. A herbalist, they called her, though the fine folk of the county had a crueler word for such women. He had dismissed it all as peasant nonsense 100 times, but there is a kind of desperation that makes a man believe in anything, and Thomas Hale had reached it. That very night, wrapped in his oldest traveling cloak, he took a cart down the muddy road toward the fens. He returned before dawn, and he did not bring the woman in through the great front doors beneath the family crest. He brought her through the servants' entrance at the back, past the sleeping kitchen maids and the banked fires, up the narrow twisting stair that the household staff used, so that no one of consequence might see her. Her name was Kaylin Vance, and she shared the Duke's family name only by the strange accident of common blood that runs through half the country. She was young, no more than 24, with dark hair pinned plainly back, and a simple gray wool dress, worn thin at the elbows. Her hands were rough from work, her boots caked with fen mud, and over her shoulder she carried a battered satchel of woven rushes. She looked entirely out of place among the gilt mirrors and marble of Oakhaven, and she seemed to know it, keeping her eyes down and her steps quiet. But when Thomas led her into the sick room and drew back the curtain, everything about her changed. She did not flinch at the smell, though it made the old steward's stomach turn. She crossed straight to the bed, set down her satchel, and with careful fingers began to unwind the linen from the Duke's forearm. Thomas held a candle close, his hand trembling. The wound was a terrible thing, a deep, weeping gash across the muscle, its edges swollen and dark, and running through it all a sickly green tinge, as though something living had taken root beneath the skin. Kaelin went very still. For a long moment she did not speak. She leaned close, breathed in the sour scent of the wound as though it were a book she was reading, and pressed one gentle fingertip to the puffed skin at its edge. Something crossed her face then that Thomas Hale would remember for the rest of his days. Not fear, not disgust, recognition. "I know this," she whispered. Thomas nearly dropped the candle. You have seen it before?" "Once." She looked up at him, and her gray eyes were bright and fierce in the candlelight. "My father showed me, when I was a girl. It is not a fever from any battlefield. Your grand doctors have been treating the wrong sickness entirely." She rolled up her sleeves. "This is a marsh blight. It comes from a wound taken in standing water, and it does not answer to blades or leeches or prayer." "Then it can be answered?" Kaelin was already reaching for her satchel, her jaw set. "If we are not too late," she said, "it can be beaten, but I will need until morning, and I will need you to lock that door." Kaelin worked, while the whole great house slept. By the light of a single candle she emptied her rush satchel across the bedside table, and the fine polished wood was soon covered with things that had never before been allowed inside Oakhaven Manor: bundles of dried root tied with twine, a twist of waxed paper holding pale seeds, and, wrapped in a square of damp cloth to keep it living, a fistful of moss so strangely blue that Thomas Hale mistook it in the candlelight for a scrap of dyed velvet. "Fen moss," she said when she caught him staring. "It grows in one place only, out where the water runs blue over the old peat. My father spent 30 years learning what it could do." She began to grind it in a small stone bowl, adding a few drops of dark liquid from a stoppered bottle. A sharp, pungent smell filled the room at once, clean and bitter, cutting straight through the sour reek of the wound. "Fetch me boiled water and clean linen, and keep that door bolted, whatever you hear on the stair." Through the long dark hours she tended him. She packed the ground moss into a thick green paste and pressed it into the wound, binding it fast, then unwrapping and repacking it fresh, each time it drew the poison out. She boiled a fistful of bitter root down to a black tea, and cradling the Duke's heavy head against her arm, coaxed spoonful after spoonful past his cracked lips. Once he thrashed and moaned, and it took all her strength and the old steward's together to hold him. Twice she thought his breath had stopped, and twice she waited, white-faced, until it dragged itself back. Thomas dozed at last in the chair by the fire. When he woke, the candle had guttered out, and a thin gray light was creeping in around the edge of the curtains. The Duke's chest was rising slow and deep, and the terrible waxy pallor had gone from his face. Kaelin knelt at the bedside, hollow-eyed with exhaustion, her fingers still resting at Garrick's wrist to count the beat of his blood. She looked up at the steward, and, for the first time since she had entered that house, she allowed herself a small and weary smile. "The fever has broken," she whispered. As if he had only been waiting for the word, the Duke stirred, his brow creased, his hand twitched against the coverlet, and then Garrick Vane opened his eyes. They were dark and clear, and though they were clouded with confusion, there was a living man behind them once more. His gaze moved slowly about the room, over the fire, over the weeping old steward who had risen half out of his chair, and came to rest at last on the strange young woman kneeling at his side. "Who?" he said. His voice was a dry rasp, the first words he had spoken in 3 weeks. "Who are you?" Thomas Hale made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. "Your Grace, oh thank God. Your Grace, you're back with us." But before Callan could answer, before Garrick could gather the strength for another word, the peace of that dawn was shattered. The bolt on the chamber door had been drawn back. In the doorway, in his fine black coat, stood Dr. Alistair Pruitt, returned at first light to arrange the matter of the priest, and behind him crowded a knot of household folk and 2 of the estate's own guards, all of them drawn by the noise, all of them staring at the impossible sight of the dying Duke, sitting up in his bed with color in his cheeks. For a moment, Pruitt's smooth face went slack with shock. Then his eyes fell upon the peasant woman at the bedside, upon the mud on her boots and the strange blue paste smeared across her hands, and something ugly moved behind them. A physician of the Royal College, silver-haired and celebrated, had pronounced this man beyond all saving. And here was a Fenland herbalist making a liar of him in front of the entire house. Whatever thought passed through his mind in that instant, he made his choice quickly. "Seize her," he said. Callan rose to her feet, backing against the bedpost. "I have done nothing but heal him. Look at him. Look with your own eyes." "I am looking." Pruitt stepped into the room, and now his voice carried, loud and certain, pitched for the gathered servants to hear. "I am looking at a man who was calm and failing in his sleep, not 1 day ago, and who now burns with an unnatural fire in his blood. These Fenwiches know the old poisons. She has dosed him with some volatile draught to give a false show of life, and when it burns out, he will be worse than before. I have seen it done. This is no cure. This is sorcery and crime dressed as mercy. It was a monstrous lie, and yet it was told with such polish and such authority that Callan saw the doubt bloom at once on the faces around the door. The maids drew back. The guards' hands went to the hilts at their belts. In that house she was a stranger, with mud on her boots, and no name of consequence, and he was a doctor of the crown. "That is untrue," she said, and heard how thin her own voice sounded against his. "Take her to the county gaol," Pruitt ordered the guards. "She will answer for what she has done to his grace." From the bed came a rasping sound. Garrick was trying to speak, trying to raise his hand, but 3 weeks of wasting had left him weak as a newborn, and no sound would come that anyone could hear over the physician's ringing accusations. Thomas Hale shouted that it was madness, that the girl had saved him, but he was only an old servant, and no one was listening to old servants that morning. The guards started forward. Callan had one heartbeat to decide. She could stand her ground and trust that the truth would save her, in a house where the man accusing her wore gold on his coat, and she wore holes at her elbows. Or she could run. She snatched her satchel from the table, sweeping her precious bundles into it, and bolted for the second door, the narrow servants' door by which she had come. A guard lunged and caught nothing but a fistful of gray wool as she tore free. Down the twisting back stair she flew, through the steaming kitchen where the cook cried out and dropped a copper pot, and out into the frozen dawn. She did not stop running until the manor was far behind her, and the noise and press of the waking city market had swallowed her whole. There, gasping, hidden among the fish stalls and the ballad sellers and the lowing of penned cattle, Callan Vance leaned against a cold stone wall and tried to understand how saving a man's life had made her a criminal. Behind her, up on the hill, the great house of Oakhaven watched over the city like a closed gray eye. By the third day, the whole county had heard some version of the tale, and no two tellings agreed. In the great library of Oakhaven, where the winter sun slanted gold across shelves of leather-bound books, the Duke sat propped in a deep armchair with a fur rug across his knees, eating his first solid meal in near a month. It was only broth and soft bread and a little stewed pheasant, and yet he ate it like a starving man, and every mouthful put more strength back into his hands. Thomas Hale hovered at his shoulder, refilling his cup and beaming like a proud father. "She said you were to rest, Your Grace," the steward fretted. "Not to be up and about so soon." "She," Garrick said, setting down his spoon. His voice had come back stronger than his legs. "You keep saying she, Thomas, and yet no one will tell me a plain thing about her. Where has she gone?" The old man's smile faltered. He busied himself with the tray. "That is a matter best left until you are stronger, Your Grace." "Thomas." But before the steward could be pressed into answering, the tall library doors swung open without so much as a knock, and a very different sort of man came striding in. He was perhaps 30, dressed in the height of fashion, a bottle-green coat cut close to a lean frame, a silk cravat tied in an elaborate knot, his fair hair pomaded and curled. He wore 3 rings on his fingers and a smile on his face, and neither the rings nor the smile were quite paid for. This was Lord Corin Vane, the Duke's cousin, and the nearest living heir to the whole vast estate should Garrick die. "Cousin," Corin cried, spreading his arms wide, "they told me at the gate you had risen from your deathbed, and I said no, it cannot be. Poor Garrick was as good as buried, and yet here you sit, eating pheasant. What a miracle! What a joy!" "Corin," the Duke's tone was cool, "you came quickly. I don't recall sending for you. I came the moment I heard you were unwell." Corin lowered himself into the opposite chair, without waiting to be asked, and his sharp eyes traveled over his cousin's face, weighing the color in his cheeks, the steadiness of his hands. "The whole family was sick with worry. I confess I have been here some days already, staying in the East Wing, seeing to your affairs while you slept. Someone had to." Garrick knew perfectly well what seeing to his affairs meant in his cousin's mouth. Corin had been drowning in gambling debts for 2 years, and there was only one inheritance in the county large enough to pull him back to shore. But the Duke was too weary and too glad to be alive to fence with him just then, and so he only nodded and let the man prattle. What Garrick did not see, because he was busy with his broth, was the flicker of pure fury that crossed his cousin's face when the pheasant was carried away, and it was plain the Duke meant to keep on living. Corin excused himself soon after. He did not go to the East Wing. He went instead down a servant's passage to a small unused parlor near the kitchens, where a certain silver-haired gentleman was waiting for him beside a cold hearth. Dr. Alistair Pruitt was no longer the picture of Royal College composure. He was pacing, and his fine face was pinched and pale. "He lives," Corin said, shutting the door. "He sat there eating like a farmhand. You told me the fever would burn out inside 2 days, and leave him worse than before." "That is what should have happened," Pruitt snapped. "Any draught that raises a dying man so fast must have some violent poison at its heart. It ought to have finished him by now." He stopped pacing and pressed his fingers to his temples. Unless what? Unless it was no poison at all. The physician's voice dropped low, and there was something close to fear in it now. Unless the Fen woman truly knew the sickness. If she did, if she has drawn the corruption clean out of him, then in a day or 2 she has only to return and finish the work, and he will be whole. Not weakened, whole, and every soul in this county will know that a mud-caked girl from the marshes cured the man that Alistair Pruitt sent for a priest. He looked ill at the thought. I would be finished, ruined, laughed out of every drawing room in England. For a moment, The two men stood in the cold parlor, each contemplating his own ruin, and then Corrin Vane began, very slowly, to smile. "Then let us make certain," he said softly, "that she cannot return to finish the work." Pruitt looked up. "What do you mean? I have made it my business, these past days, to learn about our marsh witch." Corrin drew a folded paper from his coat, a page covered in his own neat, spidery hand. "Kaelin Vance lives alone, far out in the sunken fens, in her dead father's cottage, and here is the sweetest part, Doctor. That strange blue moss she used, the one thing in all the world that answers this sickness. It grows nowhere but on her own land. She keeps it alive through the winter, in a set of glass houses behind the cottage. Her father built them. Without those glass houses, there is no moss, and without the moss, there is no second cure." The physician stared at him, and Corrin watched the understanding dawn, cold and clear, in the older man's eyes. "You wish to destroy them," Pruitt said. "I wish to secure my inheritance, and you wish to keep your reputation, and it happens the two are the very same errand." Corrin folded the paper away. "My cousin's wound has been packed and cleaned, but you told me yourself that these deep marsh rots run in two waves. The corruption sleeps a little while, then flares up again, worse than before, from deep in the flesh. When that second wave comes, and come it will, there will be exactly one thing in England that can save him, and it will already be ash. And if she has moss with her, she fled the manor with a satchel, not a wagon, a handful, no more, not enough to do the deep work twice." Corrin walked to the door and rested his hand on the latch. "We need only send men out to the fens before she can gather more. A little fire, a little accident. Glass houses are made of glass, after all. Such fragile things, who could ever prove it was more than a lantern knocked over by the wind?" Pruitt was quiet a long moment. Then, hating himself and hating the girl who had exposed him even more, he gave a single stiff nod. Out in the whispering commons of the city that same evening, hidden in a doss house among the market crowds, Kaelin counted the moss remaining in her satchel by candlelight. It was pitifully little. She would need to reach the glass houses and cut more within 3 days, or the Duke's deep wound would open again, with no cure left to close it. She did not yet know that other men were already thinking of those very glass houses, and of fire. Kaelin left the city before the market bells had rung. She could not stay another hour. Word of the Duke's miracle recovery had spread through every tavern and washhouse, and with it, the crueler word that a fen witch had bewitched him and fled the law. Twice already she had seen the estate guards moving through the crowds with her description on their lips, and it was only a matter of time before some quick-eyed peddler sold her out for the price of a pie. So she pulled her shawl low over her hair, slipped through the eastern gate with a train of peat carts, and turned her face toward home. The road out to the sunken fens was no road at all for much of its length, only a rutted track of frozen mud that wound between bare hedgerows and flooded ditches. No coachman would take her, and she had no coin to hire one if they would. So she walked. When a kindly eel merchant recognized her father's name and offered her a corner of his cot among the barrels, she took it gratefully and rode a few miles before the track grew too soft and she had to climb down and walk again. The country changed as she went. The hills flattened. The hedges gave way to reed beds and standing pools crusted with thin ice, and the wind came off the marsh with a wet cold that got into the bones and would not leave. This was her country, and she loved it the way one loves a hard and honest thing, but she saw it now with a fearful eye. Every stand of rushes might hide a watcher. Every cart that overtook her made her heart lurch until it had rattled past and gone. She was being followed. She felt sure of it. In the animal way a hare feels the hawk before it sees the shadow. Once, Glancing back from the top of a low rise, she thought she saw two riders far off on the track behind her, dark against the pale afternoon, moving at a walk. When she looked again a moment later, they were gone, and she could not have sworn they had ever been there at all. But she did not slow her pace after that. As she walked, she turned the whole strange business over in her mind, trying to make sense of it. She thought of the Duke, not the great lord of the county, whom she had never once laid eyes on before that night, but the man she had held against her arm, in the dark, while she coaxed the bitter tea past his lips. She had felt his heart falter and catch, felt the fever go out of him like a tide, felt the exact moment the living thing in him decided to stay. There was a bond in that which no accusation could touch. She did not expect him to remember it. Great men seldom remembered the servants who scrubbed their floors, let alone the marshwoman who had knelt at their sickbed and been chased out of the house before breakfast. And yet she could not forget the way he had looked at her when he woke. "Who are you?" he had rasped, and there had been no scorn in it, only wonder. It did not matter. She would never see him again. What mattered was the work. She let herself think it through, the way her father had taught her, plainly and without fear. The wound she had cleaned would heal on the surface, and to any ordinary eye the Duke would seem cured. But a marsh blight ran in two waves, always. The first packed the flesh, the second rose from the deep, and a wound this old and this deep would surely take the second turn. She had 5, perhaps 6 days before it did. When it came, only a full second dose of fresh moss, cut and pressed and packed, while still living, would answer it. The little she carried was old and drying, and would not do the deep work, which meant everything now depended on the glass houses. Her father's glass houses, out behind the cottage, where the blue moss grew all winter long, on beds of blue peat, under panes of thick greenish glass. As long as those stood, she could cut what she needed, whether or not she could ever get it back to the Duke, through a county that wanted her hanged. And if the deep wave came and she was not there to meet it, then all her labor of that first night would come to nothing, and Garrick Vane would die after all, 3 weeks and a false spring later than the doctors had planned. The thought put wings on her tired feet. Dusk was falling, blue and bitter, when she came at last over the final rise and saw home. The cottage sat low and dark against the reeds, its thatch heavy with old moss, a thread of smoke long dead in the chimney, and behind it, catching the last of the light, stood the glass houses. 3 long, low structures of timber and glass, her father's life's work, glowing faintly from within, where the peat warmth kept the winter out. The sight of them steadied her like nothing else could have. She let herself in, lit a rushlight, and set at once to work. There was so little time. She fed the small stove that warmed the glass houses and checked the beds of moss, running her rough fingers over the cool blue growth, choosing which she would cut and which she would leave to spread. She gathered her father's old medical journals from the shelf by his bed, the ones written in his cramped hand across 40 years, the ones that held every secret of the marsh blight, and 100 other cures besides. Those she would not risk losing, whatever came. She wrapped them in oilcloth and set them by the door. She did not sleep. She could not. Somewhere behind her on the road, she was almost certain, 2 riders were drawing nearer through the dark, and she had bolted her door against a danger she could not name. She sat by the small fire, with her father's journals at her feet and the last of her drying moss in her lap, and she listened to the wind moan across the marsh and rattle the panes of the glass houses, and she waited for a morning she was not sure she would live to see. She was right to be afraid, but she had mistaken the shape of the fear entirely. For while Kaelin sat guarding her cottage from the road, watching for men on the eastern track, another company altogether was making its slow way toward the fens from the west. hard men, hired in a backstreet tavern with Lord Corin's gold, carrying pitch and flint and no interest at all in Kaelin herself. They did not care whether she lived or fled. They had been sent for the glass houses. And back at Oakhaven, in the grand chambers where it had all begun, the Duke of Vane was about to discover a half-burnt letter that would change everything. On the 5th morning, Garrick Vane got out of bed on his own. The house was not yet awake. Grey light seeped around the curtains, and the fires had burned to embers. He swung his legs over the side of the great bed, and for a moment the room tilted and swam, and he had to grip the bedpost until it steadied. His arms were thin. His hands, once strong enough to break in a green colt, trembled at the effort of holding his own weight. But he stood, and once he was standing, a fierce and stubborn thing woke in him that had not been fully awake in weeks. He would not be a man carried about on a litter in his own house. He crossed to the window, one slow step at a time, and threw back the curtains to let in the cold, clean morning. Then he went looking for the woman who had saved his life. He found only Thomas Hale, dozing in a chair in the corridor outside, roused now to a fluster of alarm at the sight of his master, upright and roaming the halls in his nightshirt. The old steward fetched a dressing gown and tried to steer him back to bed, and Garrick let himself be helped as far as the great armchair by the library fire, but no further. "Where is she, Thomas?" he asked, once he was settled and the fire had been built up. The herbalist. "Kaelin, I have asked you 3 times now, and each time you find some new task to be about. I want a plain answer." The steward's face crumpled. He was too old and too tired and too fond of his master to keep it back any longer. "She is gone, Your Grace," he said heavily. "She fled the house 5 days ago, the very morning your fever broke. Dr. Pruitt returned and found her at your bedside, and he called her a witch and a poisoner, in front of the whole household, and set the guards on her. She ran, Your Grace, out through the kitchens and into the city, and no one has seen her since." He twisted his hands together. "I have said nothing, because I feared it would trouble you before you had the strength to bear it. She did nothing but save your life, and this house repaid her by hunting her out of it like vermin." Garrick sat very still. Piece by piece the memory came back to him, the pieces he had not been able to hold when he first woke, the bitter tea, the cool hands, the smell of the strange blue paste, a tired young face bending over him in the candlelight, gray eyes fierce and kind. He had woken from 3 weeks of dying, and the first living soul he had seen was a woman he had never met, kneeling at his bed with mud on her boots, and he had asked her name, and she had not even been given the chance to answer before they drove her out. "Pruitt," he said, and the name came out cold and flat. "The same Pruitt who told you to send for a priest, the one who bled me and blistered me and did me not one particle of good in 3 weeks. He called her a poisoner. He did, Your Grace. He was most persuasive. The maids believed him. Of course they did. He wears a gold watch chain, and she wears holes in her sleeves." Garrick's jaw tightened. He looked down at his own thin hands, at the linen wrapping still bound about his forearm, and he peeled back a corner of it. The wound beneath was clean and closing, pink new flesh, where there had been green rot. No sorcery had done that. Careful work had done it, through a long, cold night, by a woman his own house had thanked, with an accusation and a locked gate. Send riders to bring her back, not to arrest her, to beg her pardon, and offer her the freedom of this house. I will not have it said that the Duke of Vane let his rescuer be hounded into the marshes. At once, Your Grace." Thomas hesitated. "Though I must tell you, she is not the sort to be easily found. She lives far out in the sunken fens, and the country out there swallows strangers whole." Garrick was about to answer when his eye fell on the cold hearth beside his chair. The maids had been careless during his long sickness, or perhaps too frightened of the sick room to keep to their usual thoroughness. The grate had not been properly cleaned. Among the gray ash lay the half-burnt remains of a letter, curled and blackened, tossed in to burn and never quite consumed. It was only chance that made him notice it. It was his own habit of stillness, sitting quiet by the fire, that made him reach down and draw it out. Most of the page was gone, but across the surviving corner, in a neat and spidery hand he half recognized, a few lines had escaped the flames. He smoothed the scrap against his knee and read them. The words that remained were these, and they turned his blood to ice. Send the men to the fens before she can gather more. A cleansing of the glass houses. No cure left when the second wave comes. And, at the very bottom, half a signature, the downstroke of a C. He read it twice, then a third time, slowly, and the whole shape of it came clear to him at once, cold and complete. His cousin, Corin, who had appeared at his bedside the moment he was strong enough to see him, all smiles and worry, who had been prowling the house for days, seeing to his affairs while he lay senseless. Corin, who stood to gain the entire estate the instant Garrick stopped breathing. And this half-burnt letter, plotting to send men out to destroy the very thing that could save his life a second time. The second wave. Caelan had said something of that, in his fever, or perhaps to Thomas. A marsh blight comes in two waves. The first was beaten. The second was still to come, and the only cure grew in glass houses out in the fens, where hired men were even now being sent with fire. Garrick surged out of the chair. The room lurched, and he caught the mantelpiece and held on, breathing hard, until it settled. Your Grace. Thomas was at his elbow in a moment, alarmed. You are not strong enough. Sit down, I beg you. There is no time to be strong. Garrick pressed the scrap of letter into the old man's hands and let him read it. He watched the horror dawn on the steward's face. She saved my life, Thomas, and my own blood means to see her burned out, and me dead by the same fire. She has gone home to those glass houses. Corin's men are already on the road to them, if they reach her first. He did not finish it. He did not need to. You cannot ride in your condition, Your Grace. But even as he said it, the old steward's protest was fading, because he had known Garrick since he was a boy, and he knew that particular set of the jaw. Saddle my horse, the Duke said, the gray, and say nothing to my cousin, nothing at all. Let him think I am still abed. He was already reaching for his riding boots. The storm came down out of the north, before Garrick had ridden 5 miles. It began as a darkening of the sky, a bruised and swelling gray that ate the morning light. Then the first fat drops struck, cold as sleet, and within the hour the heavens had opened in earnest. Rain came in gray sheets, driven flat by a wind that howled across the open country and found every gap in his coat. The track turned to a churning soup of mud that sucked at the gray mare's hooves and slowed her to a laboring walk in the worst stretches. Ditches overflowed, whole fields became shallow lakes. The world shrank to a few yards of streaming water and the dim shapes of hedgerows looming and passing in the murk. Garrick rode through all of it, bent low over the mare's neck, and it was the hardest thing he had ever asked of his body. He had been 3 weeks dying, 5 days from his sickbed. He had no business on a horse in weather that would have tested a well man, and every mile of it told him so. His arms burned with the strain of the reins. His thighs, wasted by the long fever, shook with the effort of gripping the saddle. Twice a wave of dizziness swept over him, so black and complete that he nearly went down into the mud, and both times he clung to the mare's mane and waited it out, teeth gritted, until the world swam back into place. The rain ran cold down his collar and soaked him to the skin, and the old wound in his forearm throbbed with a deep, dull ache that frightened him more than the cold, because he knew what it might mean, but he did not turn back. Every time his strength faltered, he thought of the half-burnt letter, and the gray eyes in the candlelight, and the sea at the bottom of that page, and he touched his heels to the mare's flanks and pressed on. The high mountain pass was the worst of it. The track climbed away from the flooded lowlands into bare, stony country where the wind had nothing to break it, and it struck the two of them, horse and rider, like a living thing trying to tear them from the mountainside. The mare balked and shied at the edge of a swollen stream that had been an ankle-deep brook a day before and was now a brown torrent tumbling boulders. Garrick dismounted, took her head, and led her across on foot, the freezing water dragging at his legs to the knee, feeling for each footing on the drowned stones. On the far bank, he stood shaking with cold and exhaustion, and for a long moment he was not sure he could climb back into the saddle at all. He climbed back into the saddle. "Come on," he told the mare, and his voice was raw. "A little further. She is worth a little further." He was not entirely certain, in that streaming gray world, why the fen woman had come to matter so much to him. She had saved his life, and a debt of that size was reason enough for any man of honor to ride out. But it was more than the debt, and he knew it, sodden and half-frozen on that mountainside. It was the way she had knelt at his bed without knowing whether the whole household would turn on her, and healed him anyway. It was the memory, sharpening now with every mile, of a face that had held no scorn and no fear of him, only a fierce refusal to let a stranger die. In a life full of men who bowed and smiled and wanted his money, she had wanted nothing from him at all, except that he should live. He had known her waking for the space of a single sentence, and he found he could not bear the thought of the world without her in it. So he rode. Far off across the drowned country, though he could not see them through the rain, other men were making the same journey. Corin's hired saboteurs had set out the night before, and the storm caught them too, but it did not turn them back either. There were 4 of them, hard-faced and close-mouthed, wrapped in oilskins, riding in a tight knot along the western track, with their heads down against the wet. Behind one saddle rode a covered basket of pitch and tinder and flint, kept dry beneath a fold of waxed canvas. They did not speak of the woman. They had been told there was a woman, alone, of no account, and that she was not their concern. Their concern was 3 long, low buildings of timber and glass behind a marsh cottage, and the beds of blue moss that grew inside them, and their orders were simple: burn them to the ground and leave nothing green alive. They came at the fens from the west, over the flat drowned levels, while Garrick came down out of the mountains from the east. Neither party knew of the other, and Kaylin, sitting up through the storm in her father's cottage with the journals wrapped by the door, watched the wrong horizon entirely. Straining her eyes toward the eastern road for the estate guards she still believed were hunting her, while the true danger closed on her home from behind. The rain slackened toward dusk. It did not stop, but it thinned to a cold, steady drizzle, and the wind dropped, and a thick gray mist came creeping up off the marsh to fill the spaces the storm had left. Through that mist, the 4 riders came at last within sight of a low thatched roof, and, behind it, the faint greenish glow of glass. They reined in on a rise a quarter-mile off, and the leader lifted a hand. "There," he said, "the cottage, and the glass houses behind. Lord Corin said we were to wait for full dark, so no one on the road can mark the fire and name us for it." He looked up at the fading light. "Not long now. Get the pitch ready." One of the men swung down and drew the waxed canvas off the basket. Another struck a shielded light and set it under his oilskin to keep it burning dry. They moved without hurry and without any heat of feeling, as men do a thing they have been paid for and mean to finish clean. Below them, in the cottage, a rushlight flickered in the window. Kaelin was still awake. She had cut what moss she dared, and pressed it, and wrapped it, and now she sat with her father's journals at her feet, listening to the marsh and the last of the rain, watching the eastern road where no one came. She had no notion that 4 men crouched on the western rise above her home with pitch in their hands and fire under their coats, waiting only for the dark. And she had no notion that a single half-dead rider on a gray mare was driving himself down out of the eastern mountains through the failing light, closer with every stride, in a race whose finish neither he nor the men on the rise yet knew how near it stood. Full dark came, and with it the men. Kaelin heard them before she saw them. Not hoofbeats, for they had left their horses on the rise and come down on foot through the reeds, but the small wrong sounds that a marsh dweller knows in her sleep. The suck of a boot in mud where no beast should be walking. A whispered word, quickly hushed, the faint clink of metal. She had spent her whole life reading the language of the fens at night, and every word of it now told her that men were moving through the dark toward her home, and that they had not come by the road. She rose from the fire without a sound, her heart hammered. She had been watching the eastern track for the estate guards, and here instead were strangers stealing up on her from the marsh side, from behind, where the glass houses stood. The glass houses, she understood it all in a single cold rush. They had not come for her at all. They had come for the moss. She snatched up the rushlight and slipped out the back door into the drizzle, and what she saw stopped the breath in her throat. 4 dark shapes had reached the nearest glass house. One held a shielded lantern. Another was crouched at the timber base of the structure, and in his hands was a bundle of pitch-soaked rag, and he was pressing it up against the dry old wood, where the frame met the ground. "Stop!" The word tore out of her before she could think better of it. "Get away from there! Stop!" The men turned. For a moment, the whole scene hung frozen. The 4 of them and the young woman, standing alone in the doorway with a guttering rushlight and no weapon but her voice. Then the leader spoke, low and unbothered. "Told you there was a woman. Don't matter." He nodded to the man with the pitch. "Get on with it. Light it." "You don't know what you're burning," Kaelin cried, starting forward across the wet grass. "That moss is the only cure for the sickness that took the Duke. If you burn it, he dies. Do you hear me? A man's life is in that glass. His life's no concern of ours, and neither's yours." The leader stepped into her path, a wall of oilskin and shadow. "Stay back and keep your mouth shut, and you'll take no hurt this night. Come nearer, and you'll be sorry. Barrow, the fire." The man called Barrow struck flint to the shielded lantern's flame and touched it to the pitch-soaked rag. It caught with a soft, hungry rush, a bloom of orange light in the dark, and he pressed the burning bundle against the base of the glass house. The old dry timber began to smoke, then to blacken, then to burn, a small, eager tongue of flame licking up the frame toward the glass, and the beds of blue moss beyond. "No!" Kaelin tried to dart past the leader, and he caught her by the arm and held her fast, and for all her struggling, she could not break his grip. She could only watch as the flame climbed, as her father's life's work and the Duke's only hope began to burn, which was the exact moment that hoofbeats came thundering out of the dark. They came fast and heavy, striking sparks off the stony rise, a great gray shape bursting through the mist, with a rider low on its neck. The horse plunged straight into the ring of lantern light and reared, 4 hooves lashing the air, and the 4 saboteurs scrambled back in alarm. The rider hauled the mare down and swung to face them, and though he swayed in the saddle with exhaustion, though his face was gray with cold and sickness and streaked with rain, there was no mistaking the bearing of the man, nor the fury in his voice when it rang out across the marsh. "Stand away from that fire! Every man of you, stand away, on your lives." The leader recovered first. "And who are you to give orders out here in the middle of nowhere, riding a lord's horse, and he got no further. "I am Garrick Vane," the Duke said, "Duke of this county, master of the ground you are standing on, and of every acre from here to the sea. You are trespassing on my land and burning property under my protection, and I know the name of the man who sent you and the color of the gold that bought you." He let that settle, and he saw it land, saw the flint go out of the leader's eyes, and something wary and uncertain come into them instead. "Look at me. You know I am no marsh farmer. Put out that fire this instant, and there is yet a chance you leave these fens as free men. Let it burn, and I will see every one of you hunted down and hanged for it, and Lord Corin will not lift a finger to save you, because Lord Corin does not so much as know your names. He made certain of that. Ask yourselves why." The 4 men looked at one another in the flickering firelight. They were hard men, bought for a hard errand, but they were not fools, and the Duke had put his finger on the very thing that a hired man fears most, which is to hang alone for a rich man's crime, while the rich man dines in comfort and forgets he ever met them. The leader's certainty had cracked. He glanced at the growing flame, at the imposing figure on the great gray horse, at the plain, unbearable fact that the master of the whole county had come riding out of a storm to stand in their way. "He said the place was empty," Barrow muttered. "He said no one of account. He never said the Duke hisself, because he meant you to hang for it," Garrick said. "Now, the fire." For one long breath it hung in the balance. Then the leader swore, low and vicious, and turned on his own men. "Put it out! Put it out! You heard him. We're not swinging for that green devil in his green coat." He tore off his own oilskin and began to beat at the flames with it, and after a startled moment, the others fell to it too, and Kalin, released at last, flew to the glasshouse with a bucket from the rain butt and dashed water across the smoking timber. Together, the strangest company that Marsh had ever seen, the Duke half falling from his saddle to lend his failing strength, they beat and doused the fire out before it reached the glass. When it was done, the glass house stood scorched and blackened at one corner, but whole. The moss within was untouched. The 4 saboteurs did not wait to be thanked or arrested. They melted back into the dark toward their horses and were gone, and Garrick let them go, for he had neither the men nor the strength to hold them, and it was the moss he had come to save, not the wretches Corin had spent. He slid down from the mare, and his legs would not hold him. Kalin caught him before he fell, and for the second time in a week, she found herself holding the great Duke of Vane in her arms, this time in the mud and the drizzle of her own dooryard, both of them soaked and shaking and alive. "You came," she said, staring at him. "You rode out here. Why?" "Because I owed you a life," he said hoarsely, "and I do not care to die still in your debt. Word travels fast in a small country, even a drowned one. By the following midday, the whole of the sunken fens knew that the great Duke of Vane had ridden out of a storm to save the Marsh girls' glass houses from burning, and half of them had come to the village square to see it for themselves. They stood in their patched coats and clogs among the market stalls, the eel catchers and the peat cutters, and the goodwives with their baskets, and in their midst, seated on a bench outside the old stone chapel, sat the Duke himself, pale and drawn but upright, with Kalin at his side. He was not well. Kalin could see it, though the villagers could not. There was a grayness creeping back into his face, and now and again a shadow of pain crossed it, and he pressed his bandaged forearm to his side, as though to hold something in. She knew what it was. She had been dreading it for 5 days. The second wave was near. Into this gathering, an hour before noon, rode Lord Corin Vane. He came at the head of a small party, his bottle-green coat splashed with mud, his fair curls flattened by a long, hard ride, and his smiling mask entirely gone. Behind him, gray-faced and reluctant, rode Dr. Alistair Pruitt. Corinne's saboteurs had crept back to him in the night to confess their failure, and he had understood at once that the whole scheme now hung by a thread, and that his only hope was to reach the fens ahead of the story and drown it in a louder one of his own making. He reined in before the chapel and looked down at his cousin with open contempt. "So here he sits," Corin announced, pitching his voice to carry across the square. "My poor deluded cousin, dragged half dead across the county by a marsh witch's spell. Good people of the fens, you are being deceived. This woman is no healer. She is a poisoner who has fed my cousin some foul draught to muddle his wits and bind him to her, and when it fails, as it must, he will die, and she will have his death upon her hands." He turned to the crowd, spreading them wide. "Look at him. Look how pale he is. Does that seem to you a cured man, or a dying one?" A murmur ran through the villagers, uneasy, wavering. The Duke did look pale, and a fine lord in a green coat spoke with a weight that a fen girl in a grey wool dress did not. Garrick rose from the bench, though it plainly cost him. "You would know all about poison and death, cousin," he said. "You who sent 4 men to burn this woman's glass houses to the ground so that when the sickness returned there should be no cure left to save me. I have your letter, half burnt in my own grate, your hand and your signature both." "A forgery," Corin said smoothly, "or a fever dream. Where is your proof of anything, cousin, but a witch's word and a scrap of ash? Show these people you are cured. Show them the wound. Go on. Bare your arm." It was a challenge meant to shame, for Corin believed the wound must still be an ugly thing. But Garrick took him at his word. He unbuttoned his cuff, and Caelan helped him unwind the linen, and he held his forearm up for the whole square to see. Where there had been green rot, there was clean pink flesh, closing, healing, no trace of corruption anywhere upon it. A gasp went round the crowd. Corin's certainty flickered, and in that very instant, at the worst moment it could possibly have come, the second wave struck. Garrick made a small choked sound and staggered. The color drained from his face all at once. His bared forearm, clean a heartbeat before, flushed an angry red along the line of the old wound, and beneath the healing skin something rose and darkened, a shadow of the green rot, swelling back up from the deep flesh where it had lain sleeping. He swayed and would have fallen if Caelan had not caught him. Sweat sprang out on his brow. The deep infection, exactly as she had foretold, had woken. Corin seized on it with a cry of triumph. There it is, before your very eyes. The witch's cure has failed. He is dying. I told you he was dying. Her poison has run its course, and now he rots where he stands. Take her. Seize the criminal. The crowd surged and muttered. It looked, for one dreadful moment, as though Corin had won after all, as though the very proof Garrick had offered had turned in his hand and damned them both. But Caelan did not falter. She had known this hour was coming. She had cut fresh moss from the scorched glasshouse that very dawn and pressed it living into a fresh green paste, and it was in the satchel at her hip. While Corin shouted for her arrest, she was already on her knees beside the Duke, tearing open the satchel, packing the fresh paste deep into the flaring wound with swift, sure hands, pressing the last of her father's bitter root to his lips. "Drink," she told him. "Trust me. Drink and hold on." The square went silent, watching. The moss drew, the way it was made to draw. The angry red along Garrick's arm faded even as they stared. The swelling beneath the skin sank away. The gray lifted from his face like mist off water, and within the space of 100 heartbeats, the man who had seemed to be dying before them all drew a deep, steady breath and stood on his own 2 feet, and the wound was quiet once more. Caelan turned to the crowd, still on her knees, her hands green with the paste that had saved him twice. That was no failure. she said, and her plain voice carried clear across the hushed square. "That was the second wave of the marsh blight. I told the Duke 5 days ago that it would rise from the deep on this very day, and here it has risen, at the very hour I named. Would a poisoner know the sickness so well that she could tell you the day and the hour of its turning, and stand ready with the only cure in England to meet it? A poisoner would have fled. I stayed. I have healed him twice before your eyes." The crowd understood. You could see it move through them, the slow turning of the tide. The girl had not been caught out by the relapse. She had predicted it, to the day, and cured it where she knelt. No fraud on earth could have done such a thing. And Dr. Pruitt understood it best of all. He had spent his whole life in the science of medicine, and he knew, with a sick and final certainty, that no trickery had done this. The Fen girl had truly known the blight that he had failed even to name. His accusation was ash. His reputation was ash. And there was only one soul in that square who could pull him down further than he had already fallen. He looked at Corin. Then he swung down from his horse, and in front of the whole gathering, to save the last rag of his own neck, he spoke. "The letter is no forgery," Pruitt said. "Lord Corin wrote it. He hired the men to burn the glass houses, and he did it so that his cousin would die and the estate would fall to him. I heard it from his own mouth. God forgive me, I said nothing, because I feared for my name, but I will not hang for him." Corin's face went white. The crowd turned toward him as one. And the great Duke of Vane, healed and standing tall, raised his hand. "Lord Corin Vane," he said, "you are stripped this day of every privilege, every allowance, and every claim upon my house. You will quit my lands by nightfall, and count yourself fortunate to leave them a free man." There was nothing left for Corin to do but go, and under the hard eyes of the whole Fen country, that is what he did. 10 days after a marsh girl had first been smuggled through the servants' door of Oakhaven Manor, she came back through the great front doors beneath the family crest, and this time the whole household bowed as she passed. The change in the estate was a thing to see. The sick room that had smelled of rot and despair now stood open to the winter light, its curtains thrown wide, its windows unshuttered. Where a grand council of physicians had once packed their bags and pronounced a man dead, a long, airy hall on the ground floor of the east wing had been swept and scrubbed and filled with clean cots and shelves and a great scarred work table, and above its door a fresh-cut sign had been hung. "The Oakhaven Infirmary," it read. "Founded in the 10th year of the century, that all might be tended, the rich man and the fen cutter alike." Garrick had wasted no time. On the very first morning that he could walk a corridor, without a hand at his elbow, he had summoned the entire medical council to the great library, the same silver-haired gentleman of the Royal College, who had bled him and blistered him, and left him for the grave. They came expecting fees and flattery. They found the Duke waiting for them, well and whole, with a Fen girl in a clean grey dress standing at his side, and a plain wooden box on the table before him. "Gentlemen," he had said, "I sent for you 3 weeks ago to save my life, and every one of you failed and took your leave and told my steward to send for a priest. I hold no grudge for the failing. A man may fail, but you did more than fail. When someone succeeded where you could not, you did not thank her and study her methods and grow wiser for it. You called her a witch and set the law on her and drove her out into the marsh to protect your wounded pride. One of you went so far as to conspire in the burning of the only cure in England, that I might die rather than owe my life to a woman without a coat of arms." Pruitt had not been among them. He had confessed and quit the county, disgraced but unhanged, which was more mercy than he had shown. But the rest had shifted and reddened and studied the carpet. "The Royal College taught you a great deal," Garrick had gone on, But it did not teach you the one thing that matters most in the science of healing, which is that a cure is a cure whether it comes from a gilded chamber or a fen cottage, and a wise man cares only whether the patient lives. I am disbanding this council. Its charter over my lands is ended this day. You may collect your fees from my steward and go. And that had been the end of the old order at Oakhaven. In its place, he had built the new. It had taken him only those 10 days, for a duke who sets his whole will and his whole purse to a thing can move mountains, and Garrick Vane had never in his life wanted anything as fiercely as he wanted this. Where the council had been, there would now be an academy. A pioneering house of botanical study, the first of its kind in all the county, where the old marsh cures and hedge remedies that fine folk had scorned for centuries would be gathered and written down and taught, and joined to what the colleges knew, so that no dying man need ever again be lost, for want of a piece of blue moss that a peasant girl could have named in a heartbeat, and at its head he had placed the only person in England fit to lead it. They stood together now in the doorway of the new infirmary, on the 10th morning, watching the first cartloads of her father's glasshouse beds being carried in and settled under the tall, bright windows. Caelan had ridden back to the fens and returned with everything: the living moss, the journals in their oilcloth, 40 years of a poor man's careful learning that no royal college had ever thought worth the reading. It would all have a home here now. It would all be safe and used and passed on. "Grand Director," Garrick said, and there was a smile in it. "It sits strangely on you still. I can see it. It sits strangely because it does not belong to me." Caelan ran her rough fingers along the edge of the work table, over the deep old scars in the wood. 10 days ago, I was a witch to be hunted out of your kitchen. A title and a fine hall do not change what I am. No, they do not. He turned to face her, and the teasing went out of his voice. You are exactly what you were 10 days ago, when you knelt at a stranger's bed and saved him without knowing whether the whole house would thank you or hang you for it. The world was wrong about you. It is a small thing, and long overdue, that the world should be made to say so. He glanced down at his own forearm, healed clean now, the skin whole and quiet, no shadow of green anywhere beneath it. 1,000 physicians gave me up. You mended me in a single night, and then again in a village square with my own cousin howling for your arrest. There is no title in England grand enough to answer that. Grand Director will have to do, until I think of a better one." Caelan looked at him a long moment, at the great lord who had ridden half dead through a storm to stand between her life's work and the fire, and something passed between them in the clean morning light that neither had words for yet, and neither was in any hurry to name. There would be time for that. There was going to be a great deal of time, now. "There is a girl in the village with a wasting cough," she said at last, practical as ever, turning back toward the light, "and an old peat cutter whose leg has gone bad on him. If this infirmary is truly to be for the fen folk as well as the fine ones, we might begin with them, then begin with them." Garrick stepped back and let her pass through into her own hall, into the long, bright room that was hers to command. "Grand Director," she went in. Later, when the carts had been unloaded and the beds settled and the first patients seen, she stood alone for a moment at the tall windows at the far end of the infirmary, looking out over the winter gardens of Oakhaven, where the last of the frost was melting from the hedges in the noon sun. She thought of her father and the 40 years of learning he had poured into a set of glass houses in a marsh that the world had never once thought worth its notice. She thought of the long, cold night when she had knelt in a strange, grand chamber and coaxed a dying man back to life. And she thought that he would have liked to see this, the old man, his cures gathered up out of the mud at last, and set in the light where they might do some good, and his quiet marsh daughter, no longer hiding in the fens, but standing at the head of a new thing, in a new hall, at the dawn of a new age of healing. She was no longer a hidden village girl. She was the pioneer of a world that was only just beginning.